In this episode of the Exploring Information Security podcast, how disinformation will impact the 2024 election.
Computers now have primary control of critical functions.
Houston, recommend vector transfer.
Your go for APU shutdown on time.
Roger, go for deploy.
Nice to be in orbit.
Welcome to the Exploring Information Security podcast, where you will learn, explore, and grow your security mindset. I'm your host, Timothy D. Block, and in this episode, we'll be exploring how disinformation will impact the 2024 election. That's in the United States, by the way. And with me to do that is Renee DiResta. She's the author of Invisible Rulers, The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. I can highly recommend the book, even though I'm still going through it. It is one of those page turners that's just really hard to put down. Show notes for the show can be found at exploresec.com/EIS. Feedback for the show is at timothy.dblock@exploresec.com. You can hit me up on LinkedIn if you want to connect. Just let me know you listen to the podcast, and we will absolutely connect. So rate, and then of course also rate the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. That can really help with getting more visibility. I think I recently got a thing that says I'm number 23 in technology in one of the countries. We'll do a state of the podcast at some point, but yeah, so I'm starting to see some more people getting into the podcast, and anybody that's been doing rating, really appreciate that. If you haven't, I would highly recommend it. Again, it's going to help with the reach and get the podcast and the episodes, which are meant to be, helpful and for people to explore different topics out to those people. So this was one that I wanted to do, especially with the upcoming election here in the United States. I reached out to a few different people, but Renee was the one that responded, and she's a great person to interview. Very thoughtful, very well-researched on a lot of stuff. And we kind of get into a little bit of everything within disinformation. At the end there, she talks about the, kind of this being a crossover, but to me, I feel like this is just information security, cybersecurity, all the stuff here. We talk about it in the field quite a bit, and it's really interesting to dive into this topic in particular. So, with that, let's just go ahead and get into it. What kind of got you started in the within disinformation? And I mean, you wrote the book, which is really good, by the way. I haven't finished it, but Invisible Rulers. But like, what kind of started that?
Yeah, so I opened the book talking about just being generally interested in how narratives move around the internet, how ideas become popular. But what happened for me was that I started writing about narratives that I was looking at. I was a mom. I had about a 1-year-old at this time, and I was writing about the anti-vaccine movement in the context of measles and things like that. There was an outbreak at Disneyland. And I started getting very interested in kind of network science analyses. So I did computer science undergrad. I was looking for ways to think about this. We had Twitter that had become popular. There were ways to create visualizations to show people how, high centrality figures in clusters of accounts shaped the conversation. And I kind of partnered up with a data scientist who helped me do an analysis of that. We published it in Wired. And then I wound up getting some outreach from the U.S. Digital Service, which was or is a group that is in government that tries to bring techies to work on certain problems in government for very, very short-term stints. They call them like parachute teams. And I was asked to participate in a parachute team looking at ISIS on Twitter. They were kind of intrigued by how I had thought about this problem, so to speak, the way that narratives were moving, the ways that communities were shifting in response, things like this. And they said, would you be interested in coming and working on this project to look at this sort of terrorism application of this same phenomenon? And I said, yeah, of course. I don't know anything about terrorism, but I'd love to. They said, well, there are other people who know about terrorism. We want people who understand the internet. And so that was kind of how it started, because that was the real shift into not just activists and people sort of using social media to shape opinion, but really bad actors using it for very particular manipulative reasons. And as I was doing the ISIS work for that month-long period or so, we had begun to talk about Russia, which the Internet Research Agency had begun to act more and more visibly. And the idea that social media manipulation would be limited to small terrorist organizations was unrealistic, given that governments, incredibly well-resourced governments, could use the same system to achieve their aims as well.
Yeah. So how is this like similar to, because that's immediately when I thought to, you said ISIS, and then switching over to pretty much Russia, which is a pretty, nation states are doing this, right? And I think I recently saw that they were talking about like Iran's going after Trump, and then China and Russia are going after, the Democratic Party. But like, I feel like some of this has always been around, like in the form of propaganda. Like, how is that similar, or like, how is it different?
Yeah, it's a great question. That was kind of what I wanted to do with the book, was actually connect it to these older phenomenon. Propaganda didn't emerge when some, 20-somethings sat down at desks in St. Petersburg and began pretending to be Americans, right? Very, very long history here, particularly manipulative propaganda, right? What's sometimes referred to as black propaganda in the literature, because it refers to the monochromatic spectrum. White propaganda was what nation states did overtly, right? Sort of that fuzzy line between public diplomacy, public communication, and being a little bit more pointed in shaping opinion. But you knew when you saw RT who was talking to you, right? It was very, very overt. Then there was gray propaganda, which is these accounts that are acting in the interest of the state without potentially being avowed as a state, or they're sort of connected through funding, they have close relationships with leadership, that sort of thing. So that notion of slightly more obscure. And then black propaganda referred to active misattribution, right? These media outlets, you saw this a lot during the Cold War, during World War II, in which they pretended to be something else entirely. So there were radio stations that might pretend to be German soldiers. I think I tell the story in the book, that are really being run by British intelligence. So they have these native speakers who are out there pretending to be disgruntled Nazi leadership, complaining about the rest of Nazi leadership, broadcasting into Germany, when in reality, this is a project of the UK government. So this notion of information with an agenda and subversive information with an agenda is very old. And so one of the things I was trying to do here was just connect the dots into, and here's what it looks like in this technological evolution. So what should we be doing about it here?
Yeah, because everyone's kind of got that voice, right? Especially with the internet and you kind of talk about this. I got through the first real big, what was it? The cabinets and the child trafficking ring, allegedly, that got started by like one person on social media, right?
Yep. So I think the way in which anybody can do it now has become very interesting, because what was formerly the purview of either nation states or mass media, people who controlled the means of broadcast, is now very much in anyone's hands. I don't think we've all thought about what responsibility that comes with, or what our own individual roles are in shaping public opinion or making content go viral today. So I wanted to talk a little bit also about that shift, where the audience goes from being somewhat passive, right, recipients of messages, to where the audience goes into being very much participants in shaping narratives and shaping public opinion.
Do you feel like we'll adjust to this and get better at it, or do you think it'll just continue to kind of evolve? And I'm thinking back to, like you mentioned, World War II and the Cold War, right? It just seems like it's always going to kind of just be there.
I think that's true. I just wrote it came out in Lawfare today, actually, this piece on Iran, right? Which just had the hack and leak operation, which we can talk about if you want to, but ways in which we should see this almost as table stakes now, right? Their state actors are going to meddle in elections, and they are going to use social media to do it. There's very little in the way of consequences or downsides to doing it. And so there's an expectation that it is, we should have the expectation that it is going to continue to happen. On the flip side, we shouldn't be, hysterical about it, right? We shouldn't treat it as a huge, massive event every time it does happen, because oftentimes these operations don't have very much of an impact. And ironically, that's because there are now entire teams of people dedicated to finding these networks and taking them down. So one of the reasons why the Internet Research Agency, the Russian troll factory, was able to get so big in the 2015 to 2018 timeframe, or 2015 to 2017 timeframe, was that the platforms weren't really looking for it. Right? There was no such thing as an integrity team whose job it was to go and find state actor networks and disrupt them. Now you have teams at Facebook, at YouTube, TikTok. Twitter's kind of God knows what's happening over there. But they had one. Unclear where it is these days. But you have the platforms recognizing that they have a responsibility to just kind of keep disrupting these networks. And I think it's probably a little bit like cybersecurity, right? Where there's always these adversarial attacks. Most of them don't succeed. You want to make sure that they don't succeed. And so you do have to be vigilant. And that's the environment that we're operating in.
So how does a team go and verify that essentially this disinformation, whether it's like actually true or not?
So they're not looking at whether it's true or not. So the way that platform integrity works primarily is whether it's really rooted in an idea of authenticity. So there is a little mnemonic that kind of came to be adopted by the field, which is actors, behaviors, content, ABC. And whenever you're doing an analysis into a network that you might suspect to be foreign adversaries, you're looking kind of first and foremost at the actors, right? Who are the accounts? Where are they logging in from? Are they using VPNs? Do these appear to have been previously compromised accounts? Are they all new accounts? There's a lot of signal that you can get from the account itself. We see certain things as outsiders researching this stuff. The platforms have a lot more direct visibility, including into who these accounts might be DMing in the background, whether they might log in from a system that a different account once used, a lot of these different ways that they can analyze actors, device IDs, things like this. Then there's behaviors, which is, do the accounts appear to be coordinated in some way? There are certain signatures of inauthentic behavior, account that goes for a very long time, not posting, and then all of a sudden has a whole flurry of political content, perhaps. A bunch of different signals that they're using, looking at the actors, the behaviors, and then the content might include something like, are they all suddenly sharing articles from a brand new domain that was just registered? What might we learn about this domain? So content is not so much, is this true or false? A lot of the stuff that Russia was putting out in that 2015 to 2017 timeframe wasn't actually false. It was just propaganda, right? It was sort of non-falsifiable. It was fake accounts pretending to be Texas secessionists saying things that your average Texas secessionist probably would say. So the issue is not that the opinion is bad or that the political position is, beyond the pale. It's that these are fake Texas secessionists saying that thing. And so they're actioning in large part based on the authenticity, not the substance.
That's interesting. So they're just kind of amplifying the noise, I guess, or an opinion.
Yeah, a lot of the time that's how it works. I think there's I think this is actually kind of interesting because in the olden days, if people think about World War II propaganda, they might be thinking about persuasion, right? Or, the word propaganda comes from the Catholic Church after the Protestant Reformation, saying you have a mission to propagate the faith, right? Go out and spread the truth, the true gospel, the Catholic gospel, not the heathen Protestant gospel, right? So at the time, there was this idea that you were supposed to be spreading a very particular message, but it was really that idea of propagation that's where the term comes from. And so what you see is it moves from being this persuasive effort to being much more just a matter of activation. And so one of the things that social media has done to us as a society, particularly in the US, or maybe I'll talk about the US because that's what I know best, is that you kind of declare who you are when you're on a social platform, right? You put your favorite emoji in bio, you have your favorite hashtags that you participate in, like some facet of your identity is really out there. Maybe you're a passionate poster about transit or, housing rights or whatever it is. And so what you see is now that everybody's like out there kind of telegraphing who they are, having fights with each other, a lot of the time you just see foreign actors trying to insert themselves into those communities. So they're not out there to change their mind. They're pretending to be members of them. And then they're just trying to rile them up, galvanize them, and get them to act. Maybe that's to protest. Maybe that's to support a particular candidate, but they're not trying to really move them. You don't see them trying to move, Hillary supporters to support Trump or anything like that. That notion of persuasion, that's not really in there anymore.
So I didn't even think about that. So it's just a little bit more of a subtle thing, right?
Yeah. So what we saw with, with Iran in 2022 was they were primarily trying to undermine Trump. This is another thing that I think is interesting. A lot of the time people think that a state actor is out there because they want to support a particular candidate, right? Or support a particular side or position. Sometimes that happens. You see China really working to advantage, policies that might serve China. But a lot of the time, what they are trying to do is just undermine the one that they don't think is as good, that is not going to be good for them. So you see the Iranians doing this dynamic in 2022 where in 2020, they are pretending to be Trump supporters. They're pretending to be the Proud Boys, and they're sending threatening emails as the Proud Boys to try to make the Proud Boys and Trump supporters look violent and dangerous, as they are sending out these emails demanding that Democrats vote a certain way or change their registration. So it's a thing that they do in 2020. Then in 2022, you see them working to undermine Trump, but they actually identify in the midterm races candidates that they actually want to boost. So you do see a little bit there of them going even all the way down ballot, issuing endorsements, pretending to be progressive organizations to try to get some support for these candidates that they like. And then now in 2024, you have a hack and leak operation, and they target the Trump campaign, but they also target the Harris campaign. So there isn't as much of a sense that they are out there because they really like Kamala Harris as they're out there because they are undermining a candidacy that they really don't like. Also, that guy, they were successfully hacked. The Harris team was not. So there's sort of an opportunism there. But you see this interesting dynamic around undermining the candidate you dislike and then potentially doing some boosting, but we haven't seen that from them this year. So it's really just a matter of what can I accomplish using these tools with these circumstances? What most advantages the kind of state of affairs that, in this case, Iran or whatever state actor wants to realize in the world.
So what can people do to really at least identify this disinformation or even these subtle nudges?
One thing that's, I think, interesting as far as, identifying fake accounts, every now and then you'll see an account that will screw up and it'll become, somebody with sharp eyes will notice it and it'll kind of go viral. You're seeing this now, particularly as AI chatbots come into the picture. You'll see people who notice that a bot has just said something in a way that's evocative of an LLM and they kind of challenge it, reveal that it's a bot, and then it becomes a whole big thing. But a lot of the time what's happening is that these accounts do just blend in to the political positions that people hold already. So I don't think in some ways, for platform moderation reasons, it matters if they're inauthentic or authentic. But as far as the average person's response, a lot of it is just understanding that there are a lot of people out there, foreign and domestic, who really want to rile you up and who really want to make people participate in this very combative way of engaging online, this very identity-based, kind of vitriolic, everybody's at war with everybody else kind of mode of engaging. And I think that's actually the bigger problem. It's not so much that it's Russia who's doing it or Iran who's doing it, because they're piggybacking on things that we do to ourselves. So I think the bigger, more important point is actually recognizing that rage bait and that kind of style of engaging online is destructive no matter who is pushing it. Sure, you can hold a particular opinion. My point is not that you shouldn't. My point is that recognizing what makes you get all fired up and want to share something is actually a really important kind of critical skill for us all to have as we're participants in sort of shaping the public conversation and shaping what our friends and neighbors pay attention to.
Yeah, see, that's a little disheartening to me, just because one, I don't get on social media a whole lot, but because now it's like, do you go back to the news media? But I feel like the news media does a lot of the same tactics, right? They're looking for the salacious headlines there,
Yeah.
but they have there is some journalistic principles versus like just going to social media and saying stuff. But like, I guess that's just a little disheartening.
It is. I mean, I'm not gonna say it's not. I don't know. Have you been following the Telegram drama that's happened over the last 48 hours with Pavel Durov getting arrested in France?
I did see that. I haven't dove into it yet, but I did see that, which was interesting.
Yeah. So there's areas where, I'm never totally sure of the overlap between, what different people in different fields are paying attention to. But that one was interesting to me because Twitter was this, like, the immediate outrage, the assumption that he was arrested to stifle freedom of speech, right? That he had been arrested because Telegram doesn't moderate speech. And this was an absolutely massive viral outrage machine all over Twitter. And I thought it was so interesting because, we couldn't even wait the 48 hours for the indictment or the charges or whatever to come out, or for news media to go and dig in, or people in France even to kind of articulate what was happening. And there were some very real indicators that the thing that is most likely to have happened is that there were investigations into illegal child content on Telegram, and that is very much on Telegram, that they hadn't kind of responded to requests for help with investigations. So they hadn't met some of their legal obligations. And so even as we wait to find out what's happened, you have this, consensus has formed on this kind of outrage platform. And I've been kind of watching this one unfold because I'm sort of curious to see if it turns out to be the latter, right? If it turns out to be not participating in child safety investigations and things like this, is there a moment of reflection on the platform about how quickly they immediately jumped to rage, and how they raged for 36 hours over the weekend, about this perceived affront to free speech and civil liberties, which might not have been the thing that happened at all. So I don't know. I think it's this question of what do you do? How do you react? I think at this point, it's recognizing that individuals do have agency, and telling if something is foreign or domestic is perhaps less impactful than knowing if, than recognizing how the outrage machine works.
Yeah, I've often working in cybersecurity, like vulnerabilities would come out, and I just noticed there's a lot of misinformation in the first 3 days. And so often, as long as I could, I'd wait for 3 days, or I'd loop back around to make sure I was reading some of that stuff, right? And to your point, there's another one earlier this year. I don't know if you saw this Scotty Scheffler get arrested while he was at a major championship. So I'm into golf, but he's probably the number one golfer in the world. He is the number one golfer in the world. And he got arrested on his way to a tournament because there was a traffic stop and he didn't follow the directions of the officer. And kind of the same thing happened where a lot of his supporters came on social media and were just going after the police. They started trying to look for every little thing on that police department, just as a defense for him getting arrested and going. He was put in jail and charged with like felonies. And then it took, it eventually got worked out. He got released. All charges got dropped. But it was definitely like an immediate thing where people just started jumping to conclusions. And then, like we're talking about here, there was this massive backing to a pro athlete who's perceived as a really good guy. Like he's not someone that throws his clubs or does anything else. Like he's actually like a really nice person, well spoken, things like that. So it just sounds very similar, and I'm just tying it into other stuff outside of the political election. It just seems like kind of what we're talking about is some sort of temperance or even just waiting for more information to come out.
Yeah, exactly. I think it winds up being partisan politics is, of course, one area, but a lot of times it's anything that you can read into and apply some sort of, culture warish type angle, or, the worst possible interpretation is the one that seems to pick up and get attention. And, again, the question of once the facts come out, far fewer people are going to pay attention to it. Like, it's not going to trend. People aren't going to be outraged. They're not going to read, oh, okay, charges got dropped. this is the truth of the matter. So that dynamic, I think, really continues to do us a disservice. I think that's where people who write about or talk about how social media might be differently designed are trying to get at that question of, let's assume, we all know that state actors are going to be in the mix, domestic, people with strong, real, authentic opinions are going to be in the mix. So is the best response to focus on who is speaking or the reaction that we have to the speech and the thing that we do have control over, which is how we respond to it? It's not to exonerate the platforms or the influencers who are, doing this for clout and profit, but it at least gives people a sense of ways that they can react differently in the moment and have some, agency over that experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What recommendations would you have for people, as we prepare for the upcoming elections?
Oh, man. Look, I think first it's important to note that no one party or faction has a monopoly on, either political propaganda, misleading claims, rumors, disinformation, all of it. It is something that you see across the political spectrum, because it really revolves around people having very emotional responses, and that's not a partisan factor. That's something that everybody has reactions. I think what we should expect to see, one thing that I would like to see us understand a little bit more is like the extent to which the same stories outrage people time and time and time again. So in the book, I talk about this in the context of rumors about voting, right? So I think anybody who paid even marginal attention in 2020 saw all of these claims that would just go viral over and over and over again about things like voters being bussed in, right? And who was being bussed in varies a little bit, right? Is it illegal immigrants? Is it, is it just people who live out of state? Like this narrative of like, quote unquote, the bussed in voter has been in American politics for a long time. And that story tends to recur. And it's almost, I can't think of a time when it wasn't. It is essentially always a, one of these urban legends, right? The bussed in voter. The other thing that you see is like dead people voting, which, there's sometimes a grain of truth. There's like, 3 or 4 people will vote each year using some dead relative's name. They get caught, but there's not an epidemic of dead voters. Nonetheless, those stories, the sort of apocryphal, like, Arizona went to candidate so-and-so because of the dead voters is a thing that you are quite likely to hear. Just using Arizona as an example, because it's a tight swing state. You have the same, that dynamic of, mail-in ballots in a, either being fraudulent or being improperly destroyed because some postal worker is out to get you. These are out to get your side, I should say, your candidate. These stories come up and they recur over and over and over again. And there's almost never a there, right? There has never, the American electoral system is free and fair. Like the election administrators do a great job. Nonetheless, these stories go viral every single time. And I have no doubt that we'll see the same thing happen again in 2024.
Yeah, it feels like it started with hanging chads, right? And every just about every election since, and really within the social media platforms, it's the other side stole the election after the results.
Right. Or if the results don't come in time, or, there are certain interesting things that happen. I remember in 2020, there were people who were trying to pre-bunk is the term we use, right? Trying to let people know that a narrative is about to happen or that it is likely to happen, which is just that statistically speaking, Democrats were more likely to use mail-in ballots, Republicans were more likely to go to the polls. And so somebody, I don't even remember who, came up with this phrase, what was it? Red mirage, blue shift, red mirage, I think might have been the phrase they used, thinking back 4 years now. And what they meant was that there was going to be a sense of a mass Republican sweep from the ballots that were tabulated on election day, right? People who went and voted at the machines. But then they wanted to let people know that there was very likely to be a shift that was going to come after, as those mail-in ballots were tabulated after the fact, just by virtue of how ballots are processed. And also that in some states, you can have a certain number of days after election day, it's postmarking, processing, these sorts of things. And they were trying to explain that this was actually quite likely to happen. But nonetheless, when it did happen in some jurisdictions, you saw allegations that these were like the found ballots that the Democrats had just kind of, dropped off in suitcases, right? So even though there was this effort to try to explain the mechanics of, statistically speaking, what was likely to happen given partisan voting behavior trends, even though those efforts were made, when it happened, you still did have these stories about, ballots in a suitcase and these sorts of things. Like they rigged it to win, and unfortunately, it is. Again, it's not a there's no one party that has a lock on that kind of thing. So it winds up being a challenge that continues to plague us going into 2024.
Yeah. You mentioned statistics there, and I've been trying to think of how I could get this in this, because I'm a very data analytics. It's kind of like an amateurish thing for me that I like looking at, and to me really kind of uncovers a lot of the truth. How does like statistics play a role in disinformation, or don't they?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So as far as statistics, you see a couple different things happen. First, there's just misinterpretation of statistics, right? People who just, don't necessarily understand statistical claims. You see this happen sometimes in health, health misinformation. It's pretty prominent. This, by the way, is not a thing that only happens to ordinary people. You'll see media headlines that will say something like, arsenic in your Cheerios is going to poison children, right? These sorts of things where they'll take a statistic where they'll quote some scary sounding number related to the, like a toxic chemical, and they won't explain that it's not there at a concentration large enough to matter. So there's these things where, like, you say the number instead of the percentage, you're not necessarily characterizing it correctly. Sometimes this is happening inadvertently. The reporter themselves might not understand what they're looking at. Sometimes it's it's intentional, right? It's manipulative. I saw a story go by the other day on I think it was a TechCrunch article that said like 30% of 7 to 9-year-olds have Twitter accounts. And I was like, there's no way. There's absolutely no way. There's no way. And I think if you got down into the data, it said something like on devices that were being used by 7 to 9-year-olds, there was some percentage of them that had hits to a Twitter URL, which does not translate into the person having a Twitter account. It just means that maybe the kid was on like YouTube and clicked on a comment, or saw something and clicked a link, or was browsing the internet, searched for something and made it to x.com or whatever. So there are just these dynamics of like, how do you understand what is being represented? There's also things though, where it gets a little bit more down into the weeds, where more complicated things, like there's something called Benford's law, the law of anomalous numbers, that talks about like the distribution of certain digits follows a particular pattern. And that is, so the idea is, if you have statistics related to maybe ballot processing distributions and things like this, or ballot counts going up over a period of time, people will argue that this doesn't follow Benford's law, meaning that because this law exists, because it represents a certain types of data sets, that if there is a deviation from the statistical concept, it must be because of fraud. So in that way, you have some sort of like the other, the thing is going in the other direction. You're alluding to kind of a complex concept, and you're arguing that data in the real world doesn't follow it. Ergo, the only possible explanation must be that there is fraud. So you see stats coming into the conversation in some pretty unexpected ways at times.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. What resources do you recommend for people that want to learn more about this topic?
There's a bunch of really interesting researchers who are posting regularly on blogs and Substacks. I like Conspirator Norteño is interesting. He just does kind of interesting short-term analysis projects that kind of get interesting facts out there into the world. Digital Forensics Research Lab, the DFR lab at the Atlantic Council. They have people all over the world who are looking not only at foreign trolls targeting the US. But since this is a global phenomenon, people who want to follow and understand it at a global level, I think their case studies are really, really great. There are, let's see what else. There's a lot of, I think a lot of us who post on Threads. I name checked Lawfare a little bit earlier. I think they do really interesting stuff too. Again, a whole bunch of contributors to the site. Just Security, which is another blog that brings in some of the law and cybersecurity voices, has that interesting crossover. Those are, I think, probably top of mind right now. Of course, there's the academic blogs and papers and journals and things like that for people who really want to go deep. And you can find, one thing, if you like statistics, the Journal of Quantitative Description is one that comes to mind, where there actually are people out there just trying to quantify a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. And so they just have some really interesting papers that they publish that are very accessible to the average reader, just around, what is happening on the internet. How do we quantitatively describe it?
Yeah, it seems to be a lot of like human behavior that we're kind of talking about here. And
totally. And I think there's one other, Stanford has a Journal of Trust and Safety, and a former colleague of mine runs that. And that's where you'll actually see people who work at tech platforms publishing. So they'll actually go and publish case studies for people who want to understand content moderation, or who want to get deeper into these questions of how do platforms know if something is inauthentic or harmful, or how are their processes evolving, their policies evolving. Journal of Trust and Safety is a great one for that.
Cool. Any last thoughts or any closing thoughts?
No, I appreciate, it's always nice to have these kind of cross-disciplinary chats, and I hope your audience finds it interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it does align with a lot of, I deal with security awareness, so a lot of human behavior, because I'm trying to change behaviors, right? I'm not just yelling at people saying, don't click on stuff. It's like really understanding why are they doing different things. And it again comes down to curiosity. And as you mentioned, it does seem, everyone talks about how bad today is, but it's like you realize we're on the internet, social media, and we have time to complain about some of the smallest little things going on within society, right? So I think there's still a lot of alignment there.
There is one thing that I think that I've seen as I've followed cybersecurity folks on these topics. The thing that's so interesting about hack and leaks, let me just connect the dots on this. Iran has been hacking for a long time, right? So is Russia, so is everybody, right? They've got their kind of elite hacking teams. The thing that's so interesting, where it kind of intersects, I think, between cybersecurity and information operations, is actually the hack and leak. It's the and leak part that is what makes it right into the influence operation. They're not there hacking to try to get information that advantages them from an intelligence standpoint, right? They're not there looking for trade secrets or U.S. strategy or top secret documents or anything. They're there looking for ways to take information and humiliate an opponent. It's kind of interesting, right? It's like the synthesis of these two things is people who use spear phishing campaigns not to breach a system to get, to quietly sit there and amass information over time. No, the entire point is to do that dump, right? To outrage the public, to rile up the online mob. So it is interesting to see this intersection between ways that manipulators use certain tactics for the purposes of like conduct certain types of attacks with one intent in mind, versus how we see that manifest over in the IO field.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's the IO field, by the way?
Just information operations or influence operations.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, information is power. All right, Renee. Well, thank you for joining me to discuss this disinformation, I guess, really, especially with the upcoming elections. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the day.